High rent, high property values, high prices at the store.
A single person working a good job, making good money, can't make it.
As budgets increase, wages stay the same.
Will there be property owners in Licking County who might then be priced out of their homes, who might be priced out of their neighborhoods?
Now the divide widens.
It got to the point that I called children's services on myself because I couldn't take care of her anymore.
With voters rejecting more school bonds and levies,
Are you going to see bigger class sizes?
Absolutely.
suburbians saying no more affordable housing,
So you're the 2-year-old, huh?
and more people not finding a place to call home.
Thank God that I still have custody of my children while I'm homeless.
These are the hidden costs of today's housing crisis.
Good evening, I'm Lisa Rontola, and for the next 30 minutes, I'm diving into housing issues that are affecting you. From the high cost to the taxpayer-funded solutions, are we doing enough? 2023 is a big year for homeowners in Central Ohio, as some are already seeing the values of their properties spike. Countywide reappraisals are happening in Delaware, Franklin, Licking, Perry, Pickaway, and Pike counties. Auditors say values are coming in historically high, with increases of 30 to 40%. Why so high? Some auditors are calling this the perfect storm, with inflation, lack of affordable housing, and major population growth. Homeowners fear the more your home is worth, the more property tax you'll have to pay.
My grandparents were here, my parents, my aunt and uncle are here.
In his hometown of Worthington, Ohio,
The original oven used to be tucked in here very, very tightly.
architect Dustin Mondrak found his dream home.
You feel like you're living outside.
You do. We have many people who come here and go, wow, this is like a treehouse.
Living life just above the creek bed.
Right now, you and I are actually cantilevered out over nothing right now.
He wasn't prepared for the value of his picturesque property to elevate to. He received notice that his $310,000 value was jumping to $411,000, a $101,000 spike.
We would love to stay here indefinitely, yes.
When they go up, that almost jeopardizes that future a little bit.
It does. It potentially compromises our ability to stay here.
Dustin's increase came out of the 2022 reappraisals, months before all 450,000 properties in Franklin County will be reassessed.
In that we have historic underbuilding of housing. We have a population increase. We know property owners, new buyers are paying a premium.
Area County auditors use the prices of neighborhood home sales and your own home improvement projects to calculate your new property amounts. Franklin County Auditor Michael Stenziano predicts appraisals to jump by 30 to 35% countywide.
Any buyer I talk to says, I know I paid a little bit more because that was the only option we had.
Auditor Michael Smith in Licking County
Could go 50 or 60% on certain properties.
expects an average spike of 30 to 32%. Due to the arrival of Intel, he expects future reappraisals to possibly go even higher.
I'm sure you do receive tears
Sure.
or fears,
Absolutely.
of folks not wanting to lose their home.
Absolutely. We hear that all the time.
And in Union County,
Here's this. We were due for an update, not for everything to be reassessed.
Amanda White called us to say she can no longer afford the tax on her Richwood property that's value jumped from $69,000 to $97,000 out of the just released 2022 updated appraisal. She took her concerns to Village Council.
Just like, our properties were reassessed this year and they weren't up for a reassessment.
That's not my job, so I don't have a clue. So
But you're our mayor.
I will have to try to find out.
We understand and recognize the concern people have of being property taxed of their neighborhood.
County auditors say your property tax will not go up dollar for dollar with a property valuation increase, but future bonds and levies will likely affect your budget.
There is always a tension going to the polls, right? Every time a levy or a bond issue is on the table, there's this internal tension.
Dustin decided to appeal his 32% increased value by filing a complaint with Auditor Stenziano's office. He found city-funded improvements to the creek on his side of the bank contributed to the 2022 increase.
All of this level used to be up here, and we could kind of like walk around the house.
He's optimistic his new value will be reversed.
I don't know where we would have been if we had just accepted it.
More than 750 viewers also took our poll this month when we asked, do you want your property value to increase? 14% said yes, 86% said no. Experts tell me inflation is a contributing factor to our historically high property values. They're calling the current rates stubbornly high. Last June, inflation hit 9%. While it's fallen to 5%, it was just 2% from years 2000 to 2020. In attempts to curb inflation, the Fed continues to raise interest rates. That's having a drastic effect on costs of car loans, credit card borrowing, and of course, mortgage rates. This month, a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage averaged more than 6%. Last year at this time, we were seeing 5.25%. Applications for FHA loans, which are popular with first-time home buyers, are down 17% from a year ago.
It was tough decisions along the way when voters are saying no because, we need money to operate.
As the housing crisis looms in Central Ohio, many school districts are suffering from the effects. Less than half the bonds and levies placed on the primary this month passed in Ohio. That's a drop of nearly 20% from this time last year. We're asking if this is now widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots for generations to come.
Did you guys have fun at the zoo yesterday? Yeah. Awesome.
The new halls and classrooms of Northridge Elementary School took years in the making.
Don't act up, there's cameras.
Construction of the new building got the okay from voters with a bond package 2 years ago. And sitting miles away from the new Intel site now,
Intel coming into the area has definitely been a game changer.
Northridge Local passed its renewal levy this month that will generate more than $2 million a year for the district. Northridge Local was one of 4 Licking County school districts
I was just joking.
to pass all of its bonds and levies this past primary.
It's a great place to come and learn. It's also a great place to come and work. And so that makes a big difference when you have a good environment in which to work.
However, Northridge's story is the minority.
Do you think the housing crisis played a factor in the failing of this levy?
Absolutely.
Ohio voters only passed 48% of the school bonds and levies this May, a drop from the 65% last primary. Renewals dropped by 16 percentage points. Bonds or levies generating new money dropped to the lowest rate it's been in 16 years.
Timing-wise, some people said it wasn't great timing.
Marysville Exempted Village School District has not been able to pass an issue that would raise new money in 15 years. They failed again this month. Now the district is discussing a hiring freeze.
Are you going to see bigger class sizes?
Absolutely.
Cuts in transportation to extracurricular events, as well as district-paid assistant coaches.
And that could hurt a kid who might be looking for an athletic scholarship.
Oh, absolutely. It's like I said, there were no easy cuts.
And before the district sees proficiency scores take a hit, district leaders say they have no choice but to go back to voters later this year.
We're spending more than we're bringing in this year.
Now I'd like to introduce our expert panel on these housing issues. I want to start with Franklin County Auditor Michael Stinziano, President and CEO of affordable housing developer Homeport. We have Jennifer Knoll with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission and Howard Fleeter, an economist who specializes in school funding. But I do want to start with you, Auditor Stinziano. We did see in this story you had said historic highs for property values, but that doesn't mean your property tax will go up dollar for dollar. But couldn't it go up? Why shouldn't homeowners in Franklin County panic?
So homeowners should be happy to see this investment going up. Not very many places do you see this kind of increase. It is a historic raw number, a little sticker shock in that regard. But under Ohio law, it isn't a one for dollar match. And so while working with the auditor's office, making sure we have fair and equitable valuation, we want to make sure the property owner understands that piece as well as the impact it could have on their property taxes.
Okay. And does anyone else want to weigh in on this question? I know, Howard Slater, you said you did.
The law that Auditor Stinziano referred to is called House Bill 920. It goes back to 1976, and I don't think hardly anybody in this state is aware of how it works, but it will roll back the property tax rates in response to the average increase in property in each taxing jurisdiction.
Okay.
So your taxes only go up if your home goes up more than the average.
But I do think, which goes on to our next question, this is going to have homeowners concerned, especially when they go to the ballot and look at new bonds or levies that could raise their property tax. We just saw this May, less than 50% of Ohio school bonds or levies passed. Is this going to be a new normal? And I was quite surprised you said Ohio puts more bonds and levies on the ballot than any other state.
We do. We by a long shot. So we've had, historically, over the last 40 years, we average about 400 school property tax and bond issues per year. The last 10 years, that number has been down by about a third. I think most school superintendents will tell you it's getting harder and harder to pass levies. We're seeing fewer continuing levies on the ballot, more levies that last for 5 years or so, and then we're also seeing more renewal levies because of that. Those at least pass about 85 to 90% of the time. New levies pass about 40 to 45% of the time, but the last 10 years, those rates have been in the 30% for new money. So fewer new levies, fewer continuing levies, and lower passage rates.
Even renewals dropped this go round, and that doesn't cost the homeowner taxpayer any more money.
Exactly, right. And that, typically, like I said, those pass 85 to 90% of the time. And every single type of property tax levy passed at a lower rate this May than it did than last May. And the only school issue that passed at a higher rate was a school district income tax. And I think that's interesting. People, I think, are concerned about any kind of a property tax increase right now.
Todd Johnson, who is the treasurer of Marysville Schools, he did say that he does feel that the housing crisis plays a factor. Is this going to widen the divide between the haves and have-nots for generations to come?
That's a good question, right? I mean, I think in neighborhood I live in, I think housing prices have gone up. It's harder for young families to own a home, which I think most people consider to be the American dream. And so I think owning that home, interest rates are higher now, housing prices are higher now. I think there's concerns about whether that's a good investment for people to make right now. And if it is a good investment, as the auditor said, that's a good thing, but you need to be able to pay your taxes and make sure you can stay in your home.
Okay. And does anyone else want to have any input here?
So I just offered, as Howard was referencing, there's also a lack of owner homes available for new buyers coming into the market. So we're not building that starter house. In the 90s and early 2000s, you saw a lot of subdivisions that were that starter price point, that 150, that 200, and now you see new subdivisions going online. They're $400,000 and $500,000, $600,000. So there's not an entry point for those new homeowners to come in to be able to even start to have the challenge of the property tax values of insurance and things like that, and create that stability. And home ownership is a path of housing affordability, because every month here's what mortgage is going to be. And so a lot of times that's a way to get into affordability, because you have an expectation versus in a renter and landlord situation, your rent may go up in a year. And so being able to manage that is really something that we've lost in our market in terms of entry into the market.
Well, that also goes into the question that I want to pose to you. When homeowners see their property values go up, if they see property tax go up, some of these property owners are landlords. So how does that affect their tenant, the renter?
So definitely part of rent structure is you're paying for the cost of that unit, whether that's an apartment or a house. And so property taxes going up does come back down to the renter, and they may see increases in rent. So any of those insurance costs or utility cost increases, any of those increases that affect a homeowner are affecting the renter in the same way, because those costs are generally being passed on through that landlord-tenant relationship.
And Jennifer Knoll, now I ask you, something that I really concentrate the data, the stat that I get from WSYX in my housing coverage is The region needs 14,000 new homes per year for the next 10 years in order to meet demand. I find that so high, but you said that's actually low.
Right. That's the low end. So that number comes from the Building Industry Association of Central Ohio. This is a study they did about 5 years ago that looked at the rate of regional job growth and found that to keep up with the rate of job growth, we would need at least 14,000 new homes every year to 2050 to keep up with that growth. So they took another look at that research last year and really were able to validate those findings. In fact, if we look at sort of the historic trends in the number of new homes that we're bringing online every year, we really need to double housing production, at least in the next 10 years, just to make sure that we're keeping up with the growing population.
Well, I guess that poses the question, how did we get here?
Yeah.
Why are we in such a deficit?
Yeah, well, Central Ohio is not unique in what we're experiencing right now. We've kind of had a perfect storm of different things that have happened over the years. Going into the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, we're actually building at a pretty good clip for our region. But when the recession hit, building came to a stop. It put a lot of builders out of business. Our region probably weathered that storm better than a lot did, but the reality is in the years since about 2010, we have yet to hit the production numbers that we had prior to that. I think our best production year, we might have had about 12,000 new homes come online. So when we think about that minimum threshold of 14,000, we have yet to hit a year where we've cleared that.
And those don't sound like great numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's progress, but we recognize that we need to do better. You know, one of the things I think about is we celebrate job creation in our communities. It would be great if we celebrated housing in the same way.
Okay, thank you. And anyone?
I mean, I would say there's a consequence to those numbers, and that's the housing demand. Central Ohio has been one of the hottest real estate markets, not just in Ohio, but across the country. That's part of our valuation piece. And so in the last 2 years, 22 of the 24 months, we've seen people pay month over month higher to get into those homes than they had prior. And so that drives a lot of, on the real estate side, the pricing out and just the challenge of what's the appropriate valuation in different communities.
And well, that goes into, that's a big discussion going on right now at the State House. Let me pose that right now. What are we hearing about adjusting the way we reappraise homes in the state of Ohio?
This isn't a new challenge. And this process of how valuation occurs, how it gets tied to property taxes has been ongoing. It's been decades long, the system, but you haven't seen across the state jumps like we're seeing right now. And 3 years ago, it was a 20% average in Franklin County. As mentioned, it's going to be anywhere from 30–40% in Franklin County. And so I think the General Assembly is trying to find that balance. I think there's fundamental changes. You could look to other jurisdictions across the country where there are places or circuit breakers in play where maybe valuation is accurate, but property tax has a consequence. Senator Herschel Craig has been a great champion in past General Assemblies of trying to find that right balance. But now we're just hearing kind of tweaking the raw number, which really won't be the fundamental change that a lot of homeowners need to see.
And what areas might this hurt more? Is it rural areas? Is it urban areas? Or it's all of the above?
It's a share pain across the entire state of Ohio. I mean, if this is the rules and procedures, which county auditors, other county officials have to follow, it's going to be shared and spread out across the area. We're unique in Franklin County with that perfect storm, but that is something we're seeing across the state as well, of just the valuations jumping post-recession.
So you're making $41,000. You cannot afford rent over $1,100, and that's what you're facing right now.
Yeah, I'm living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it.
A struggling middle class say they're being priced out of their homes in Franklin County. Increasing rent is now becoming more than half of the monthly income. To be eligible for programs like Section 8, someone needs to make less than $20,000 a year. How about those who make more and still can't afford the current cost of rent?
I rented this room out for a while.
Robert Gary called this apartment home for the last several years.
When I moved in, it was a really nice complex.
And now the former U.S. Marine and blue-collar worker says he's forced to leave. His $20 per hour wage is not enough to afford a new lease at this East Columbus complex.
Could you pay $1,100 or more for rent?
Not with the price of everything else right now. I mean, that's half my income.
Gary said East Point Ridge wanted $1,161 a month to $1,959, depending on the lease length, and even the low range was nearly $250 more than what he was paying before.
$240 was just insane.
We called East Point Ridge and sent this email to ask why it's increasing rent by more than 20%, according to Gary's notice that he provided us. Management has yet to respond.
You don't think $41,000 a year is poverty?
Oh, no, it shouldn't be.
And now Gary's finding out the price hikes can be felt across the community.
How many apartment complexes do you think you've called?
Dozens, more than that.
Gary found nothing below $1,000 per month, and this is what we found out with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. The population of the Columbus area is expected to grow to more than 3 million people in about 25 years. To keep up with demand, the region needs to produce 14,000 new homes per year for the next 10 years. Last decade, 1 new home was produced for every 3 new households. Morpsey admits to low supply, creating higher housing prices.
So you're making $41,000. You cannot afford rent over $1,100, and that's what you're facing right now.
Yeah, I'm living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it.
But according to this PewResearch.org wage calculator, Gary ranks in Columbus's middle class, along with 53% of the community. A quarter of the community is classified as upper class and 23% lower class. Those making less than $20,000 a year qualify for federal assistance, and right now nearly 40,000 in the Columbus area either hold a voucher for assistance or on a wait list for one.
No one cares anymore. The companies are just out there taking as much as they can get. I get a raise, they raise the prices to take my raise away.
Unable to make the January 14th deadline, Gary spoke with us January 6th, days before he moves out.
Most of the stuff's already packed, it's in the closet, boxes are already ready to go.
While he feels his income should afford housing, bills, and maybe even a yearly vacation.
It is so unlike anything I've seen in my 60 years, in America.
He's days away from crashing on his friend's couch.
Priority, no matter where you go, she's coming with you.
Oh, yeah. Until he figures out his next move.
Do you think your story is the story that we don't hear of very much?
Yeah, I think it is, because everyone I know that's at my level has somebody else. They're in a 2-income, they either have roommates or they're married and have 2-income household.
Gary has moved in with his buddy in Plain City, which is adding 15 minutes to his commute. More people are losing their homes during this crisis, including parents with kids. Last school year, more than 21,000 K-12 students in Ohio were listed as homeless, according to the Department of Education. In the Columbus area, the number of homeless students jumped by 20% from the previous school year. Jeanette Grimmick called me this year saying she's kept her 11-year-old daughter out of class as they lived in and out of hotels or in their car.
I want to send her to school either not having a shower or not having a place to live. And I didn't want her to be bullied in Westerville schools. They're going to want to know why she's like that. That's a rich neighborhood.
Westerville City Schools couldn't talk about this case, but leaders told us the district has 82 students listed as homeless. The district provides transportation, free meals, counseling, and waives any school fees for its homeless students. The Franklin County courts are seeing close to 1,900 eviction cases filed on average per month since January of this year. I asked area agencies who was helping keep renters in their homes. Last year, Franklin County Children's Services spent nearly $1 million to help pay for rent and utilities for a total of 225 families. The Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority has 13,600 active vouchers in its Housing Choice Voucher program, a type of Section 8. However, 26,000 applicants make up a wait list for the program, with the average wait time of more than 3 years. And Impact Community Action says it spent $125 million over the last 3 years on rental assistance for 40,000 families. It hopes to get new monies for that program soon. Other agencies who are helping can be found at rentful614.com. And we are back with our expert panel. And after those stories, I want to start with you, Leah Evans. Homeport is dedicated on closing this housing gap. I believe you said 250 individuals per year. How are you able to do that? How are you able to build affordable housing? What's the incentive?
So we work with federal housing tax credits to help us close the gap so that we can have rents that are affordable to residents like Gary, who is making $20 an hour and making about $41 a year. So the federal standard is that you should not pay more than 30% of your income towards your housing expense. That allows you to have the resources for food, transportation, other things that you're spending money on. So the tax credit program allows us to charge those lower rents that are going to be affordable long term. Through those tax credits, we are developing housing just like any other real estate developer. The difference is that we have a more equity brought to it from the credits that allow us to have lower rents.
Okay, and you're saying lower rent. What's the price point here?
So it depends. All of our rents, we have 40 plus communities across Franklin County. So rents are actually very driven by where you are. So I was at one of our senior properties on Alum Creek yesterday. A one bedroom there rents for $690. We have a property that's under construction over near at Easton. That's under construction right now. Probably those will be somewhere between $900 and $1,200. So it does depend on where the property is, whether it's a senior property or family property. And then we also have rent tiers. So there's 60% of the area median income, 50, 40, and 30. And we also accept vouchers. So we have voucher holders that live with us as well.
I could only imagine once it's built, it fills up.
Immediately. We're in a lease up right now of one of our senior properties in Linden. It's a 3-day lease up for 100 units, and we're expecting between 300 and 400 applicants.
How quickly do you get on a wait list for your properties?
So all of our properties, we can maintain wait lists. And just like, again, any other rental, you would our property managers, when there's a vacancy, goes back to that list to start to bring in people that would qualify. So it does, as one of their interviewees was sharing, it's a grind to find housing. So you're making calls, you're getting on lists, you're following up, you're finding out if vacancies are there. So it can be very time consuming and very demanding to even get into housing.
I can only imagine the folks that you talk to, how many give up?
They do, and they are living with relatives. Again, as Gary said, they're couch surfing, or they're doubling up, and they're trying to figure out a way. We had dedicated at one of our new properties on Tuesday, and one of our residents shared that she was in the midst. She was going to be homeless if not for being able to get accepted at Maple Meadows. It's over on the north side, and so it is. It's very much. Just imagine the stress and the trauma of trying to get into housing, let alone trying to maintain a job or get your kids to school, or your health, or anything else, and you're in the midst of that. It's really a severe crisis at that point.
And as you're saying this, what comes to mind, what people tell me a lot, which is also a financial burden, all the application fees. Does Homeport also charge application fees, or are they at a lower price point?
We do charge application fees, but they're what we would consider lower, not that as punitive in terms of trying to get the application done. That's part of the process. Again, we really work within the same real estate construct of any other rental property, but we have certain provisions. For example, we were recipients of emergency rental assistance from the city and through the county, and so we processed those with our residents. So they came to us, we were able to move those quickly and able to get resources to fill those gaps during the pandemic crisis. And as it still goes on, the city and county are still looking at how to bring more resources to emergency rental assistance. The demand is still just as high as it was in 2020.
I've had conversations recently on that too, with impact. Anybody else wanting to weigh in on this particular topic?
I'm an economist. This is fundamentally a supply and demand problem, right? And so clearly we need 14,000 new homes a year, and those need to be not just owner-occupied homes, but they need to be rental properties. And as Leah said, that there's a federal subsidy program to help get those built, and I think that would be an appropriate use for the state as well. And I know there have been several proposals floating around the State House lately. And I will point out that the state of Ohio is the last couple of years, to the surprise of a lot of people, have raked in much more tax money than we thought. And I think that this would be consideration of putting some of that excess tax money towards finding people places to live would be a perfectly good use of that money.
All right, thank you very much. And we did do a poll. We did ask our viewers, do you want your property value to increase? Of the more than 700 who answered, 86% or so said no. Reappraisals are coming out, Auditor Stenziano, in August. How many appeals do you anticipate? And of those who appeal, how many do get reversed or at least tweaked?
So we want to hear and work with all property owners. And I'll use the last 2020 triennial update as the example. We saw about 70% of those that filed, so about 3,000 of the 450,000 properties we review did have success in seeing an adjustment to their appraised value. So we encourage, work with the auditor's office. Property owners have a huge role in playing to make sure the information is accurate and make sure we're reflecting a fair and accurate valuation on the auditor side.
Okay, so 75% of those who appeal may even see a decrease in their property value, which then again, if they are a landlord, that could prevent the cost from being passed on to the renter.
Correct.
Yeah. And I do want, since we are talking about renters and schools are a big component to that housing issue, Mr. Fleeter, do you know how many renters really do go to the polls as opposed to the homeowner? Because who has the bigger say when it does come to those school bonds and those school levies?
That's right. There just isn't good data about whether, who shows up more, right? Is it renters or is it owner occupied? I think the general consensus is that people who have kids in schools have the most direct interest. The general feeling is that most people, if you don't have kids in schools, the understanding is that good schools help keep your property values up. So homeowners have that incentive as well. And renters, they don't see a property tax increase as directly. Leah pointed out that will roll into their rent, over time, but they don't get the bill from the auditor. They don't see it in their mortgage payment, so they may not perceive it as hitting them directly, but even though it does. So no one really knows the extent to which different type of people vote, and then when they go, obviously we don't know how they vote. So.
And I would think, and I could be wrong, that a past levy or a past bond would help the children of a renter who may be lower income and going to public school.
Absolutely it would, yeah. So that's, so supporting your schools, voting for levies, if the school district can make the case of what they're going to do with the money and why they need it, that is if you want to help your kids, that's one of the best ways we know to do it.
Okay. And Jennifer Knoll wanted to ask you, we're talking about the cost burden here, how much you are paying out of your overhead to go to housing. You've got great data with MORPC. What is cost burden? What are people paying and what should they be paying?
That's a great question. And Leah touched on it earlier, that the general rule is that we should try to keep our housing costs to less than 30% of our household's income. So that's your mortgage, your monthly rent, your utilities, that kind of thing. If we look at Franklin County as an example, the median household income is about $65,000. So about 30% of that would take you to about $1,600 a month that you'd like to keep your housing costs beneath. When we look at the data, what we see is that for the median homeowner in Franklin County, there's some good news there. The median homeowner's keeping under that $1,600 threshold. The news is not as good for renters. About 40% or more are spending, the median renter is spending 40% or more of their income on housing. And we really need to peel back the layers here to take a more complete look at that, because what we know to be true with housing cost burden is when you make at or below the median income, so at or below $65,000 per year, you are going to be increasingly bearing that cost burden. Again, the more you're spending on housing, the less you have to spend on equally important expenses. That can be transportation, childcare, healthcare, or medication. And we know that within Franklin County alone, we have about 70,000 homeowners, or households, who earn $75,000 or less, who are spending 50% or more of their income on housing expenses. That means we have a large number of our neighbors who are very burdened by their housing costs. They're having to make difficult decisions at home about what they're going to pay for. So not only do they bear a disproportionate burden within their own household of those decisions, but there's a sort of ripple effect in our communities too. There's a loss to our communities, an economic loss to our communities, when households are bearing more cost burden as a result.
We need our neighbors in New Albany, in Upper Arlington, in Westerville, in Grove City, in Johnstown, and Delaware to join us in this effort.
Words spoken by Columbus Mayor Andrew Ginther last September on the suburbs needing to step up in the fight to build more affordable housing. Fast forward to today, major resistance in Hilliard for the development of Rock Run off Dublin Road that would have created 256 new apartments. Due to opposition, the representative for the developer told us they reduced the number of units to 232 and eliminated a fourth floor. When we went to shoot this video this month of the site, neighbors told us they're angry about these plans and don't want it in their neighborhood. Columbus City voters passed 2 bond packages specifically for housing in the last few years. A $50 million bond package was passed in 2019, a $200 million bond package passed in 2022. With that money, the city has been able to create 1,300 new homes so far. The Central Ohio Community Land Trust is earmarked for about $80 million of that bond money. The group builds homes on the demolition sites of previous blighted properties. In this program, the trust leases the land and the buyer purchases the home. That means prices come in under market value, some $150,000 less than other homes listed in the same neighborhood.
My mortgage payment is less than what I'm paying now, was paying in rent. Yep. And I didn't, and you know, with my property, I have a garage. There, I didn't even have a parking space.
The land trust has closed with 66 homeowners within the last 3 years, 70% of them minority. To be eligible, a single person cannot make more than $78,000 a year. And we're back with our panel, and I want to start with you, Leah Evans, because we are talking about the city bond packages that were passed in 2019, 2022. Homeport received so far more than $8 million for the creation of 100 new units. Obviously, that's one funding source, but what is initiative? How is this affordable for Homeport to build these affordable homes?
Yes, and thank you. We actually, that 8.3, actually, we have it in one of our projects is 100 units, and we have another project that's another 100. So we're actually we're going to be bringing on about 200 units with the different funding sources from the city. But that tax credit that we were talking about earlier only fills some of the gap. So again, let's say a development is $10 million. In order to fill that gap, to be able to bring those rents down. Normally in a traditional development, that $10 million of costs and construction is going to be passed on through a loan that the property owner is going to get, and the rents are going to pay that. Well, I have a restricted rents, but unrestricted expenses. So to be able to get those rents low, I'd use $7 million of tax credit equity, and maybe another $2 million from the city. So every deal is different because every site is different, and every project we have different sources. Sometimes we're working with the county and getting resources from the county. Sometimes there's a tax abatement, property tax abatement as well, that's going to contribute to making that capital stack with the goal, again, of keeping those rents affordable to those moderate income workers and renters that are going to be coming in, and keeping that 30% of their income, staying true to that. And again, particularly for our senior residents, we see a growing number of seniors in our community, as you know, and so we've been continuing to build that senior product to bring that 62 and older, to bring them even further down to that income that they're having from Social Security or disability or retirement.
Mm-hmm. And something else I wanted to ask you, because we are seeing tax credits, a new proposed Ohio tax credit in the State House right now. I have been watching some of the committee hearings with that, and some of the opposition, the questions, don't know if my constituents want this type of development next to their $500,000 home.
It's a good point. That's something that we wrestle with always, is actually the zoning process. So we've talked about what needs to happen and what needs to get built, but it comes down to the details, and one of the details is the zoning process, and which is very informed by existing homeowners, existing property owners. And you're right, that battle that can happen in the zoning process can keep development from happening. It can suppress building activities. So when Jennifer's talking that we're under the 14,000 we need to be, some of that is driven by our zoning regulations and how much we're asking. Is there a house per acre? That requires you to have a lot of acreage to be able to do a house. Do you have 2 parking spaces per apartment building? That requires you to have a lot more acreage to build your building. So some of the zoning regulations are really informing what is getting built and adding to that gap in terms of how much is getting out there in the community.
Not just zoning, but resistance as well, correct?
For
I
sure.
know on more than one occasion, Columbus Mayor Andrew Ginther has called on the suburbs to step up. Do you see more resistance in the suburbs?
We see NIMBYism everywhere, to tell the truth. Like, we've had it in the city of Columbus, we've had it and outside of the city of Columbus in our communities, but we've also had really great successes. We've had a great deal of success in Whitehall. We have several of our properties there. We recently got awarded tax credits for a new development in Delaware County. So we're really excited that there are places and spaces that are making room for, really the key is that multifamily development. Where is it that rental is appropriate in the context of a single family community? There are places that makes sense and there are places that it doesn't. And so that's the conversation we want to see communities having with themselves before a project even comes forward. You need to look at what's your land use plan? Where does it make sense? You can't say we're going to be an only single family community. It doesn't make sense. That's not housing that really fits the jobs and the transportation and all the needs your community has. So where are those different variety of housing, not just this one single type of use? And that's all we want to see.
And does anyone else want to weigh in with some of the resistance that we possibly might be seeing out there to affordable housing?
I think the resistance is a reflection of just the changes going on in our community. Adding the population that's going to be added, seeing the growth as a region, that's a change for a lot of folks. And so that is something that I think, as mentioned, internal within some communities, they have to have that conversation, but it is something as a region we're going to have to adapt. If we want to continue to be growing, adding population, adding economic success, the old model needs to be adjusted, modernized, and reflective of what bringing in 3 million residents is going to look like.
And another interesting point, Jennifer Knoll, I was out at Northridge Local Schools near Johnstown, 8 miles away from the new Intel site. I asked about a population boom for that school district. They said not right away because the infrastructure is not there. Do we have land in Central Ohio that could be developed but not right away because lack of infrastructure?
We do. We also have land within Central Ohio to support the growth. So as a region, we're capable of supporting this growth that's coming. On a community by community basis, there are absolutely communities that are experiencing growth pressure that they have not experienced before. And so what we really work with our communities to do, what we think is maybe the most important thing they can do, it's actually something that Leah mentioned earlier, is having a vision for their future. And so we help our communities at MORPC to do just that. We really want them thinking about what their community's vision is for its future. Where are those strategic locations where they envision future growth and development to go? Do they have the zoning and other policies in place to support that growth? These are all really critical things that don't happen overnight, but are so important for communities, especially those that are sort of around that Intel site, to be thinking about. We see efforts underway right now in Licking County to do just that. Certainly MORPC is providing that assistance as well, but it is a really important tool.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to say on that? No? Well, I guess my next question, to help with all of this, what can we see, Auditor Stinziano, come out of the State House? What could help? What bills are being discussed out there, good, bad, and the ugly?
I mean, there's a lot of conversation that could occur. I mean, there's low-hanging fruit like eliminating the LLC loophole, enhancing, modernizing the homestead exemption. Those are things that have been around for a while that would make an immediate impact. Long term, it's how we fund our schools. The whole Duroff decision and decades long, is it unconstitutional? Can we continue with this model? Or if there's other fundamental property tax valuation changes. Other jurisdictions have circuit breakers. Some states, once you make that sale, that's the value they'll hold on your taxing purposes. They need to have that conversation. I know there was some discussion with House Bill 1 in this General Assembly towards that, but it's a budget year, and that obviously takes a lot of air out of the room as well.
Okay. And that goes to the school funding formula. Could that be, if that was a well-oiled machine, if it was working properly, could that alleviate some of the stress from homeowners and taxpayers?
The short answer to that question is yes, if it were working properly. The long answer is what is it going to take to get it working properly? So the DeRolf decision was in March of 1997. That was over 25 years ago. And we spent about 13 years on a path where we were trying to figure out the best way to fund schools, and we kind of lost the thread of that reform of the funding formula after the recession. And the last 2 years we've got a new school funding formula in place. We're in the first 2 years of the phase-in of what should be a 6-year phase-in. The House of Representatives in their budget proposal made some important changes which will continue down the path of making sure that the state aid is adequate for all school districts. Now we're waiting to see what the Senate will do. And but if the state pulls their fair share of the load, and school funding in Ohio is a state and local partnership, if the state gets the formula where it needs to be and pulls their fair share of it, that's going to alleviate a lot of pressure on local school districts to put levies on the ballot.
All right. Anyone else have anything to weigh in on that?
And it may help with the resistance, because a lot of times when you're coming in with a new development, some of that resistance is our schools can't take additional students, and we don't have the infrastructure and support. So it may help with some of the conversations the development community is having to try to bring more housing development into new spaces.
Okay, now I want to get into we did solicit some questions. And let's start with Konya in Hilliard, who said her credit score is too low for her to find decent housing in Hilliard. She feels that a low credit score should not be a factor in finding housing. What is your take on this? What is your weigh on this? Have there been conversations about credit scores in housing?
So there's a couple of pilot programs that are working on using rental history to help boost credit scores. Because she's right, it is very disheartening to know that credit on something I bought who knows ever ago is keeping me from housing. But this is how our system works. Like, this is how landlords use to do background checks and credit scores as part of the lease-up process. So I really think that some of the work that OFA and a couple of our partners at Convergence and some other areas are doing to help people get better credit scores through rental history and other payments that aren't currently tracked can help build up a whole generation of credit strength that allows people to go into housing and not have those be barriers.
Okay.
This is another thing which is a problem of having a shortage of housing. Because when you have a shortage of housing and you've got way more applicants for every vacancy than there is, then the landlords can be pickier and pickier, and they can use things like this that may or may not be relevant to whether somebody can afford to pay their rent.
Megan in Columbus, let's go back to Carrie Thompson. She says rent is too high and too many landlords are not taking care of their properties. We know in Columbus there's the 311 system, there's code enforcement, you can call your public health department, but does there need to be a more efficient and more urgency in the system?
The city is currently working on a rental registry and some of those things that would actually have, sometimes it's hard to track who is a responsible party to just the way ownership works and not being able to get directly to someone to call. So that in some cities we've seen, particularly in the coastal markets where they have rental registries and areas and opportunities for that landlord to have to be made present. Because you can, again, put a code violation, but if it doesn't get to where it needs to get and then there's no penalty for the property owner, there's no incentive for them to do the work. So it definitely is something that is, as Howard said, in a tight market, landlords can get away with things that they wouldn't get away with in a market that didn't have so much demand.
Okay. And now Megan in Columbus said she has moved here to Columbus for a better paying job. Her and her husband were living in Logan County. She pays city, state, federal, and sales tax. She wants to buy a home, but doesn't know if she could afford now the property and school taxes. She's now giving up her dream of being a homeowner, possibly now considering moving out of Columbus. What advice do you have for Megan?
I think Megan's story we're increasingly hearing, there are a lot of households where they can no longer afford or find a place that they can afford within Franklin County, and so they're finding places farther away from the city center. And this is becoming, again, with such short supply, an increasingly common challenge for communities. So not only they may find a place that they can afford in another county, but now that's going to increase their transportation costs, and so that may not net out as quite the positive. And so that's again where it's really important to make sure that we have a supply of homes of all types, of all prices, so that we can accommodate those residents who would like to live in the neighborhoods they'd like to live in.
This I find an interesting question. Angela Boykin wants to know, is this greed?
We have thoughts.
I don't know if Ms. Boykin's talking about increases on landlords. So one thing we hear often is, what's the county going to do with all this extra money? And as shared, the appraisal process, the mass reappraisal we're going through, does not become a big influx of funds for any taxing entity. It's up to the voters to approve kind of what the benefit of the bargain is and what those taxing entities will receive over the lifespan of whatever the bond or levy is. That pretty much is fixed. And so not greed in terms of the administrative process that we implement in the auditor's office, but understand the concerns and want to work and have dedicated with partners in the Board of Commissioners, partners with other municipal governments, of solutions to make sure people are able to age in the neighborhood they want to age in and be able to benefit from where they've likely invested for decades.
I've wondered the same thing, honestly, right? I mean, I get 4 or 5 calls a day or text messages from people wanting to buy my property. And I'm wondering if, any of you have any insight as to, how outside investors like that, the role that they're playing in driving up our property values. Because that to me does seem I mean, I wouldn't say greed, it's certainly opportunism, right? As an economist, you're supposed to try to maximize profits and whatnot, but that's not always, that's not always good for, for the community when you do that. So, I mean, to what extent do we know how many homes are being bought by people that are investors and are just trying to flip them and make a quick buck?
So we have seen an increase in outside investment and people holding on properties. Because of the LLC dynamic we have in Ohio law, it's a little unclear how much is outside state versus inside state. But that is another component to the perfect storm of where values are going up and that you're seeing the outside investors. Do want to caveat, they don't get their information when they contact you from the auditor's office. We get asked that a lot.
I wasn't blaming you.
No, but we hear a lot of folks, how'd they get my information? And I ask when I get those texts, where do you get it? And they sometimes say the auditor's office, and I can assure them that isn't true. That continues to be a challenge. It is because of the growth. It's still reasonable for Central Ohio, for people to be investing and compared to other metropolitan areas. But that's something I know you've got some state senators looking at, trying to find solutions to slow that down and make sure people that are in these communities are the ones making the investments.
And that also goes to, we talked about incentives to build affordable housing, but what about restrictions when prices get too high? What about a rent cap in the city of Columbus? We had some thoughts about that prior to our conversation.
Well, I mean, an economist will tell you that, some type of rent control or rent cap is very beneficial to the people that already have a place to live, but it makes it harder for people that don't have a place to live because it will reduce, further reduce supply. It was 30 years ago, but I lived in a community that had rent control, and it was almost impossible to find an apartment there. I ended up having to move 2 communities away. Instead of being able to walk where I needed to go, I had to, I had to hop on a train and do that.
And you had also had some thoughts on rent controls. It doesn't always work?
Well, again, I think there are lots of tools in the toolbox, and so that could be one. But again, investing in affordable housing, like what we do and our peers do, is a form of keeping rents affordable. It's not necessarily rent control, but there are public programs and subsidies to keep rent affordable. Even through the tax abatement process, the city has been levering on to developers and owners some restrictions on rent price incomes in order to keep rents affordable. So there's a lot of tools that can be use that also will get you affordable rents, but understand the push and the desire from the community at large to see some sort of control that would stop what they're feeling, the pain that they're feeling day to day when you have residents like Gary who's being forced to move. So understand that sentiment, but would say that there are a lot of tools that we need to continue to explore and advance, and not any one of them is going to be a panacea for what we're going through.
Okay. And now I just wanted to go around a final thought. Anything that I didn't ask today that you feel is important in this discussion? Thank you for bringing up transportation. What didn't we talk about? What do you want to leave with our viewers tonight?
I always encourage property owners to work with the auditor's office, make sure the information on the auditor's website's accurate. That's what we're going to base the valuation off of. If there are questions, if they're having challenges in paying property taxes, there are programs in the auditor's office, the treasurer's office. So we strongly encourage property owners not to wait till they get the tax bill from the treasurer, but to engage us early and often so we can work and try and find solutions before they're really at a stress point.
I just encourage participation in this process. I know it's hard to go to a public meeting or to sometimes even to make time to get out to vote. But one of the things that we were talking about earlier were what's the dynamic of who's participating in the development of our community. And that's one thing I think that we all can stay vigilant about is how do we get our voices in there? One thing I hear, Lisa, that you may hear a lot is, well, where are these people going to come from? Like when people see new buildings going up, if you're not doing some of the work that we all do, you don't necessarily see that we're getting 60 to 75 new people in Columbus every day. You don't see that growth and demand, not just in Columbus, but Franklin County and our region. And so really, I would be encouraging people to, how do you participate? And it may be just as simple as asking a friend about, hey, they were talking about something on the news, and have you ever heard of that? But participate in this process. We need to shape the community together that we want to see that's going to house everyone. And we can't do that when we have whole swaths of people that aren't involved in it.
All right.
I just would say I think affordable housing has to be absolutely one of our highest priorities. Everybody deserves to have a place to live.
Yeah, ditto that.
Amen.
It is that simple. And we're seeing a growing number of sort of grassroots organizations and communities across Central Ohio of residents saying, yes, we do support housing, and sometimes it can feel like you're in the minority, but the reality is you're probably not. And so finding those organizations, finding those ways to get involved, and finding your voice in this conversation is so important.
Will our housing crisis get worse before it gets better?
I don't know. It depends on what somewhat happens nationally and the impact that's occurring with the conversations that we're seeing at the congressional level. Our region's going to continue to grow. If we're not building, it is going to continue to see values go up. But I know everyone's really putting some thought and dedication to trying to get the housing up to where we need to be and then plan for the years to come. But it's still a little unknown in terms of will that be able to continue year over year over year.
I'd agree it's unknown. I'd say there's a quote from Nelson Mandela that says, let our choices reflect our hopes, not our fears. And so I'd say let's keep investing and planning and bring the state tax credit, the work that we're doing with the bonding, trying to get our regional partnerships. Let's keep on that so that we don't give into the fear of it getting worse. But I'd say there's a lot of uncertainty. Obviously, the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of our issues. That wasn't expected. And so even as we come back from that, I don't think we know what the next big wave will be, but that we keep staying on the path to saying we want housing for everyone.
Right. I mean, I can't see how housing price increases the way we've seen for the last couple of years can be sustainable year after year into the future. People only have so much income, and as Jennifer has said, every dollar you put into housing is one less dollar that you can spend on other things that you need. And so at some point, you would think that housing prices would start to at least stabilize and not be going up at the rates they've been, because I don't think this is sustainable.
I think one thing that's important to acknowledge is that Central Ohio is very fortunate to be a growing region. This is a place where people want to live, want to raise their families, and it is much easier to support and accommodate a growing population than it is to try to support and accommodate a shrinking one. So we have a real opportunity to embrace growth and what that can mean in terms of a better future. That said, we also have to acknowledge that with more growth comes a need for more housing, and really no community in Central Ohio can turn a blind eye to this. It's really going to take all the communities across the region working together to solve the housing crisis. That means we have to be preparing for growth. We have to be planning for our future. One thing we didn't even touch on was the relationship between housing and transportation and infrastructure, and the reality that we need to also be thinking about those as two sides of the same coin. We can help with that. We know it's, again, not going to be an overnight thing, but these are the kinds of things that can set us up to be even more thriving and vibrant in the future.
I thank you all for taking the time, being here, having this important conversation. I think this is great information to provide our viewers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this important conversation on the hidden costs of the housing crisis. Have a good night.